What if the most feared warriors in European history were not defeated by stronger enemies, but by men who learned faster, waited longer, and used nature itself as a weapon? 0 survivors. That is the only number that matters when the smoke thins over the cold, iron-gray waters of the Baltic Sea. Not a single ship slipping away into the fog. Not a wounded king crawling back to tell the tale. 0. An entire Swedish war fleet vanished in less than an hour. Erased so completely that even the sea seemed stunned into silence afterward. This was no merchant convoy caught by chance or weather. These were purpose-built warships, packed with hardened crews raised on sagas of conquest, men who believed the sea itself bent to their will, veterans whose fathers had humiliated Paris, burned the coasts of the North Sea, and stood armed beneath the golden domes of Constantinople. To them, the Baltic was not a threat. It was home, and that certainty is what killed them. They sailed with confidence born of centuries of dominance, unaware that the rules had changed beneath their keels. The enemy they faced did not fight with longships or heroic duels. They fought with patience, terrain, and a brutal understanding of fear. When the first blows landed, confusion spread faster than fire. When panic followed, there was nowhere to run. By the time realization dawned, the sea was already swallowing men who had never imagined defeat. History taught us the Vikings were unstoppable. History lied. For 3 centuries, the Baltic Sea was treated like a Scandinavian highway, a wide, familiar road of water that led east toward profit. Swedish and Danish kings looked across it and did not see resistance. They saw forests waiting to be cut down, villages waiting to be emptied, people waiting to be turned into tribute, slaves, and silver. To the Viking mind, the eastern Baltic was not a frontier. It was inventory. But along those shores lived peoples whose names barely survived the chronicles. The Curonians, the Oeselians, the Semigallians. They did not build stone capitals or crown kings in gilded halls. Their world was marsh and pine forest, narrow straits and fog-bound islands that punished anyone who arrived uninvited. They did not rush to meet the invaders. They watched. When Viking ships appeared, they studied the curve of the hulls and the depth of the keels. When raiders landed, they memorized formations, habits, weaknesses. When captives were taken, some never returned home. Not because they were executed, but because they were listening, learning, and remembering. Every raid became a lesson. Every loss became data. By the time the Norse sensed that something in the Baltic felt wrong, the balance had already shifted. And by then, there was no turning it back. At first, it looked like chance. A single ship that failed to return. A patrol that vanished near the islands of Saaremaa. In the markets of Sigtuna, traders shrugged and blamed the sea. Sudden storms, shifting currents, the anger of unfamiliar gods. No one wanted to say the dangerous thought out loud, because admitting it meant accepting that the Baltic was changing. Hidden from longship prows and royal eyes, deep inside reed-choked inlets and fog-sealed coves, something was happening. Timber was being shaped. Keels were being tested. Shipyards worked in silence, not to imitate Viking designs, but to refine them for a different kind of war. These vessels were leaner, shallower in draft, built not to cross oceans, but to strike and disappear. Where Scandinavian warships relied on reach and intimidation, these boats relied on terrain. They skimmed over sandbanks, slipped through marsh channels, and vanished into waters where heavy longships grounded like trapped animals. Every weakness was studied. Every mistake was remembered. Then came the morning that ended denial. Off the coast of Gotland, dark sails rose through the haze. No banners, no horns, no proud formation, only speed. The attack was sudden, relentless, methodical. Lines were cut. Ships were isolated. Crews never formed ranks. What followed was not a clash of warriors. It was a demonstration. And by the time survivors understood what they were facing, there was nothing left to fight back with. The Baltic had found its predators. The Baltic raiders did not fight like Vikings. They did not shout names of gods or seek glory in single combat. Honor meant nothing to them. Speed did. Confusion did. Fear did. They came in close and fast. Iron hooks tore into hulls and rigging. Torches flew, not to conquer, but to blind. Powdered lime burst through the air, burning eyes, choking lungs, turning seasoned warriors into panicked silhouettes. Fire spread across decks slick with tar. Smoke swallowed commands. Discipline collapsed in seconds. Men who had butchered Saxons without mercy, men who had stood laughing beneath arrow fire on foreign shores, suddenly broke. Some leapt into the sea in full armor, choosing cold water over whatever hissed and moved inside the smoke. Steel dragged them down. Silence followed. And then came the stories. Not rumors, warnings. Prisoners were not ransomed. They were not sold. They were offered. Forest shrines hidden from maps. Blood soaking into roots older than any king. Priests who did not pray for mercy, but searched the future inside steaming entrails. Worst of all was how they killed. No clean blade. No warrior's death. No Valhalla waiting on the other side. Fear crossed the sea faster than any longship. Within days, captains refused orders. Crews whispered at night. The Baltic was no longer a Swedish lake. It had become a warning written in smoke, blood, and silence. King Canute Eriksson stood at the edge of collapse. In the Viking world, power was never abstract. It had to be seen. It had to be proven. A king who hesitated invited rebellion, and a king who appeared weak rarely died peacefully. So Canute chose the only answer his age respected. Force. Not a raid. An annihilation. 300 ships were assembled. 10,000 men called to the lee dam. Oars beat the water like a drum of war as the fleet pushed east, toward Curonia, toward the forests that had dared to resist Scandinavia. The plan was simple. Burn everything. Erase the lesson. Restore fear. But Sigtuna was not just a royal seat. It was a trading city. A place where silver spoke more loudly than loyalty. Merchants counted coins, not oaths. They spoke many languages. They listened carefully. Some smiled at the king's banners. Some nodded. Some said nothing at all. And in the early morning haze, as the great fleet vanished beyond the horizon, one small ship slipped its moorings. Low, fast, unnoticed. It carried no warriors. Only knowledge. By the time the Swedish army set foot on enemy soil, the message had already arrived. Whispered through forests. Passed along rivers. The words were simple and devastating. The nest is empty. When the Swedish army finally made landfall, victory should have been waiting. Instead, there was nothing. Villages stood open and silent. Hearths cold. Doors swinging in the wind. Wells had been poisoned. Livestock driven off or slaughtered and left to rot. Fields abandoned, as if the land itself had chosen to flee. 10,000 warriors spread out through forests and swamps, searching for an enemy that refused to appear. Boots sank into mud. Mosquitoes rose in clouds. Time bled away. And far to the west, near Sigtuna, the fog began to move. Black sails emerged from the gray water without warning. No horns. No challenge. Just momentum. The harbor defenses failed almost instantly. Chains meant to block heavy longships lay useless, as shallow draft vessels slid over sandbanks and barriers with ease. What was designed to stop Vikings could not stop hunters who knew the water better than any map. They poured into the city like a tide that had learned how to think. Fast. Silent. Merciless. The cathedral doors shattered. The archbishop was cut down at the altar, blood spreading across stone meant to symbolize order and God. Bronze doors, icons of royal power and Christian authority, were torn from their hinges and dragged back to the ships like captured standards. This was not plunder. It was not revenge. It was communication. A message carved into the heart of Sweden, telling every king, every trader, every warrior, one truth they could no longer deny. The war was no longer where the army stood. The Swedish army turned back too late. By the time the order was given, the damage was already done. Their fleet had been hit. Ships smoldered at anchor, masts cracked, decks slick with ash and blood. Guards lay where they had fallen, black arrows lodged in their throats. Eyes still open toward a sky that offered no answers. The voyage home became something worse than defeat. It became a hunt. Fog rolled in thick and low. Islands appeared and vanished like traps. Sandbanks waited just beneath the surface, invisible until hulls scraped and stuck. This was not open sea. This was terrain built for predators. Baltic ships struck without warning, then disappeared again into mist and reeds. They did not board. They did not seek trophies. They set sails on fire. A ship without sails is not a vessel. It is a coffin that floats. Panic spread from deck to deck. Commands were lost in the fog. Oars clashed. Men prayed to gods who did not answer. King Canute pressed on. He did not slow for the damaged. He did not wait for the wounded. In that moment, survival demanded cruelty, and cruelty became policy. When the Swedish coast finally emerged from the haze, there was no relief. Only silence. Sigtuna stood blackened and broken, smoke rising from what had once been the heart of royal power. The city was dead, and with it, something else had died as well. Not just ships, not just men. Authority itself had burned away with the sails. The victory of the Baltic tribes forged something more dangerous than weapons. It forged confidence. For the first time, forest peoples who had lived scattered and cautious began to believe they were untouchable. They had shattered Viking fleets. They had burned royal cities. United, they felt history bending in their favor. So they looked south. What came was not another raid, not ships that struck and vanished, but an enemy that stayed. Stone rose where forests once stood. Castles pressed into the land like iron teeth. The Sword Brothers and the Teutonic orders arrived with crossbows, discipline, and a belief system that did not fear death, because it promised paradise beyond it. Steel met faith, and faith does not retreat easily. Once again, the forest warriors adapted. They ignored walls they could not break. They refused open fields where knights dominated. They waited. Winter became their ally. Ice replaced roads. Swamps turned into traps, disguised as ground. At Saul in 1236, the knights advanced heavy and confident. Armor gleamed, horses charged. Then the ground gave way. Frozen marshes swallowed men whole. Steel dragged bodies down. What protected them became their grave. In less than an hour, the order collapsed. Banners fell. Command vanished. Survivors fled. It was not strength that won that day. Not technology. Not numbers. It was terrain. And the people who had learned to listen to it. The final lesson was written on ice. In the spring of 1242, Lake Peipus lay frozen and silent, a vast white plain between worlds. Alexander Nevsky understood what the knights did not. Battles are not always won by strength. Sometimes they are won by where you choose to stand. He placed his center where the ice was weakest, not as a mistake, as an invitation. The Teutonic knights saw what they expected to see. A soft middle, an opening begging to be crushed. They formed the wedge and charged. Steel pressed forward. Horses thundered. Weight concentrated exactly where the lake could not endure it. Then the ice began to speak. Cracks echoed beneath iron hooves. The surface fractured. Men fell. Horses screamed. Armor that once meant invincibility became an anchor. Cold water swallowed bodies whole. Panic raced faster than any command. The flanks closed in. Retreat vanished. The lake claimed what arrogance had delivered. By nightfall, the Crusader advance was finished. Not paused. Ended. The East closed that day. Expansion stopped at the edge of black water and broken ice. And the myth of invincible crusaders drowned beneath the surface, never to rise again. Watching from the edges of history stood Mindaugas of Lithuania. He did not rush into battle. He watched. and he understood something Vikings and Crusaders learned too late. Power is not only violence. Sometimes, it is patience wearing armor. Mindaugas united tribes that had never trusted one another. Not through endless war, but through leverage. Marriage, threats, promises, timing. When the Crusaders came, he bent instead of breaking. He accepted conversion, not as faith, but as strategy. A cross for peace. A crown for time. And while enemies celebrated his submission, Mindaugas built quietly. He centralized authority. He organized armies. He chose when to fight and when not to. Then, when the moment came, he tore the cross away. Not in defiance. In calculation, Lithuania rose with terrifying speed. Pagan. Pragmatic. Ruthless. It became the largest state in Europe, stretching from the Baltic toward the Black Sea. It stood as a shield against Mongol expansion, and as a wall that Crusader steel could not break. None of it was supposed to happen. It began with a Viking raid that assumed easy victims, with forests dismissed as backward, with people underestimated. History remembers conquerors. It forgets those who teach. But the Baltic forests left a lesson behind, written in ash, in ice, and in silence.